taking the very broad, general, bird's eye view on the situation. I mean, when you look at the facts and you put the narrative aside, and I hesitate to say it because it sounds kind of controversial, but is China on a war footing? That is what I want to ask here, because as I look at these export restrictions, there is a sense of fed-upness that you sense from the aggressiveness of these export restrictions on germanium, gallium, and antimony. And there's also talk of tungsten, and perhaps even more devastatingly, there are now export controls, which, as we've seen in the past, is the first step towards full-on export bans. There are now export controls on graphite. And of course, China dominates graphite processing, as we've seen before. And hello and welcome to the Northern Miner Podcast. My name's Adrian Pocobelli. As we look at these stories, for myself, I'm kind of hanging off the edge of my chair. The drama is full-blown. However, the actual real-world consequences of this, frankly, if you're in the West, are not particularly good. To say it's concerning is perhaps an understatement here, because the big question that floats at the back of my mind of this entire export ban that was announced last week, the big question I think that looms, that I think maybe people don't really know the answer to. I mean, what's the first question that goes through your mind when you heard of the germanium, gallium, and antimony ban? Full-on ban. That's why I dare say war footing. The first question I have is, how much do we have? How much is there on the market? How much have people stockpiled? And I have a feeling that the answer to this question is actually not known. As some articles have said, companies have been stocking up. You know, if companies have been buying just on the private market, I mean, is anybody keeping tabs on this? Right? And if it is an issue, let's say for the Pentagon, I guess they're not going to advertise it. I'm guessing. Probably the last thing they need to do is tell the world, hey, actually, we have a 2-month supply of antimony and then we're cooked. Right? Now, another thing I thought was interesting on this whole situation, of course, this news came on the heels of the Biden administration announcing more export controls and limitations of semiconductors to Chinese companies. However, we have been following here quite closely the situation in Myanmar with the rare earths, and I wonder to myself, you know, when you get to brass tacks, perhaps China, you might say on a manifest level, on the surface content interpretation of the story says, okay, now that they've banned semiconductors, we can basically do, you know, what's often called a tit for tat and respond accordingly, and we're banning the critical minerals. However, I mean, let's not forget what we've been discussing here going on a month, which is a situation in Myanmar where supposedly, I mean, as we put the pieces of the puzzle together here, American-backed rebels in Myanmar have taken over a quote-unquote rare earths hub, which has been described as 300 little villages of rare earths producers. You know, villages, towns, and maybe cities that produce rare earths, from what I understand, you know, just pouring acid onto the side of a mountain. And we have some stories here which we'll go into. But I find the timing significant. So we have several stories here to illuminate this, but I mean, it is interesting, the timing on this, as we've been saying, as China gets potentially significantly cut off from its rare earth supply, that they would pull this move now. And as I've discussed in the past, it's kind of a one-way street. You don't get to play this card really too many times. I suppose they played the rare earth card back in 2010 with Japan. But what you risk is that your competitor, in this case the West, will find other sources of antimony, germanium, gallium, and potentially graphite, and all of a sudden your leverage is gone. You know, as I've speculated in the past, perhaps this is why Russia has not pulled the trigger yet. But perhaps this is China's way of saying, if you want to play ball, we're ready, which brings me back to my, you know, again, what I would say my provocative opener there. Is China on a war footing? My sense is, put it this way, they're one step closer. to a war footing than they were a week ago or a month ago. I think that we can say. This is not a small matter to cut off the United States from essential critical minerals, right? So again, drama on level 12 here, concern on also level 12, but not necessarily the kind of drama we are searching for over here. So let's take a look at some of these stories and see if we can get a clearer image on what is actually happening out here. We have a story from the New York Times, and this is dated December 9th, yesterday. China's critical minerals embargo is even tougher than expected. Beijing ordered companies around the world not to allow critical minerals mined in China to reach the U.S., while deepening its efforts to replace imports with domestic products. This is by Keith Bradshaw, reporting from Beijing and Shanghai. Alarm is rising among multinational companies doing business with China about Beijing's decision last week to order a trade embargo on the export of 4 critical minerals to the United States. The central subject of concern is a provision extending the ban to companies in other countries that transfer minerals to American firms after acquiring them from China. So alarm is rising as the New York Times starts the article here. The order is the first time China has included a broad ban on so-called transshipment in a government regulation on exports. It also underlines Beijing's readiness to escalate its tit-for-tat response to the tougher trade policies promised by President-elect Donald J. Trump. China has long condemned attempts by other countries, particularly the United States, to impose similar limits on transshipments by companies outside their borders. The ban by Beijing threatens to divide global supply chains further by forcing companies to choose whether products with certain materials and components can be supplied only to the American market or only to the Chinese market. China has been trying to persuade companies elsewhere, particularly in Europe, that they should invest and build supply chains in China, not the United States. Quote, the move marks a significant escalation of the ongoing tech war between the U.S. and China, and EU businesses are increasingly worried about being caught in the crossfire, end quote, said Jens Eskelund, the president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. So they're calling it a tech war here. Again, I think this is the manifest content. I mean, I'm sure I'm probably the only person saying this, so take that for what it's worth. But the real tit for tat here, from my perspective, is if you're going to cut off our rare earths, we're going to cut off your antimony and germanium and gallium, and we may continue with tungsten and graphite. Of course, that's pure speculation over here. Let's continue. The mineral embargo is the latest piece of an extensive initiative by China over the past nearly 2 decades to replace imports with domestic production. On December 3rd, the same day the Ministry of Commerce published the minerals ban, 4 government-linked trade associations directed companies to avoid buying American computer chips. 2 days later, the Ministry of Finance unveiled a draft plan to overhaul the bidding on government contracts, heavily favoring companies that produce in China. Again, I think China wants the West to think that it's because of the chips, because then it's not so much, you might say, a warlike act. You know, it's a good pretext for restricting exports of critical minerals, the computer chips. I dare say I think it's the excuse. I think it's them going, now's our chance. We have a good excuse. And they further disguise this move with this following move, and yet another indication that the Chinese government is ready to take a tough stance in response to U.S. policy. It said on Monday that it had started an anti-monopoly investigation into NVIDIA, the American giant that dominates the world market for the most advanced chips needed for artificial intelligence. The volley of measures could also signal Beijing's willingness to make a deal with the United States. So that is the New York Times. We have another story courtesy of the Associated Press on CanadianPressNews.ca. And this is from December 6th. China's ban on key high-tech materials could have broad impact on industry's economy. And again, this is the Associated Press. China has banned exports of key materials used to make a wide range of products, including smartphones, electric vehicles, radar systems, and CT scanners, swiping back at Washington after it expanded export controls to include dozens of Chinese companies that make equipment used to produce advanced computer chips. Both sides say their controls are justified by national security concerns, and both accuse the other of weaponizing trade. Analysts say the latest restrictions could have a wide impact on manufacturing in many industries and supply chains. Quote, critical mineral security is now intrinsically linked to the escalating tech trade war, end quote, Gracelyn Bascarin and Meredith Schwartz of the Center for Strategic International Studies wrote in a report on Beijing's decision. The full impact will depend partly on whether U.S. industries can compensate for any loss of access to the strategically important materials, equipment, and components. It's quite interesting, isn't it? I guess some people say, you can water down the amount of these materials that you use, but at a certain point, you're going to run out, seems to me. And so again, this large question mark looms, behind all of these words here is how much is actually left. Let's continue. Here's why this could be a tipping point in trade conflict between the two biggest economies, coming at a time when antagonisms already were expected to heat up once President-elect Donald Trump takes office, giving his vows to hike tariffs on imports of Chinese-made products. And just scrolling down a bit, how important are those materials? In a word, very. For the US, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and other producers of advanced technology and components, access to materials with such properties as high conductivity is crucial. Gallium and germanium increasingly are used in advanced semiconductors in place of silicon. The materials subject to Chinese export controls are among 50 the United States Geological Survey has designated as quote-unquote critical minerals, non-fuel minerals essential to U.S. economic and national security that have supply chains vulnerable to disruption. Gallium topped the list. It is needed to make the same high-bandwidth memory chips the U.S. wants to avoid allowing China to access for use in artificial intelligence and defense applications. It's used to make LEDs, lasers, and magnets used in many products. Germanium is used for optical fiber and solar panels, among other uses. A USGS study recently estimated the likely total cost to the U.S. economy from disruptions to supplies of gallium and germanium alone at more than $3 billion. Well, is that it? Is that factoring in all of the cascading dominoes that fall if you don't have the computer chips that you're trying to use? I mean, it seems to me $3 billion seems like quite a low number in that regard. And listen to this. China imposed licensing requirements on exports of both materials in July 2023. It has not exported either to the U.S. this year. According to Chinese customs data, antimony exports also have plunged. And so moving to Myanmar, this is geopoliticalmonitor.com. China's Wagner. Beijing establishes private security company in Myanmar. This is by Antonio Gracefo. And just the first paragraph here. China is collaborating with the Myanmar military junta to establish a joint security company to protect Chinese investments and personnel in Myanmar. On October 22, 2024, the junta formed a working committee to draft a memorandum of understanding for the initiative, reflecting China's growing concern over the security of its projects, particularly those under the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. So, interesting headline. Now, let's look at this new story by Frontier Myanmar, who goes in depth on the rare earth situation in Myanmar. This is December 4th. A new chapter, the future of rare earth mining under Kyo rule, and Kyo stands for the Kachin Independence Organization, which is a rebel group in Myanmar. As the subheadline here says, recent conflict has brought Myanmar's biggest rare earth mining region under the control of the Kachin Independence Organization, yet it's uncertain how it will handle the lucrative but environmentally devastating industry. An autonomous border region in northern Kachin state contains rare earth mines that are vital to global supply chains. However, mining has shut down almost completely in recent months because of a dramatic change in territorial control and ensuing Chinese border shutdowns. Since the Kachin Independence Army began a full-scale attack in September, it has seized the mountainous region from a border guard force and militia linked to Myanmar's military junta. The future of the lucrative rare earths industry now hangs in the balance. The 17 elements known as rare earths are vital components in manufacturing a wide range of items, including weapons, cell phones, and magnets used in electric vehicles and wind turbines. China has been the world's dominant exporter of rare earths since the 1990s, but around 2010 it began cracking down on domestic mining amid rising environmental and public health concerns. It has since increasingly outsourced the extraction to Myanmar, where it can dig intensively with almost no regulation. Chinese companies dominate the industry in Myanmar, extracting rare earths and then transporting them across the Yunnan province border for processing before distributing them globally. Seng Miet, a worker with a Chinese-run mining equipment company in the border town of Panghua, who used a pseudonym due to security concerns, said that a mining company typically extracts 30 to 70 truckloads of rare earths from a mountain in 2 to 3 years. His Chinese boss told him that each truckload is worth about 12 million yuan, which is about 1.7 million US dollars. Quote, whenever he sees the trucks passing through our area, he always says, "Look at all the money going by, truck after truck of money," end quote, said Sang Miet. But he and others told Frontier that the trucks had stopped since the fighting started and that the mining remained on hold. So that's an important detail, because it wasn't clear if somehow the mining was continuing under new leadership. Scrolling down, to mine rare earths, workers pour acid into holes dug into mountains and move the resulting sediment into chemical leaching pools. Then they lay out rare earths to dry, burn off excess residue, pack it into bags, and load it onto trucks bound for China. The extent of the health effects on workers, who often wear little or no protective gear, remains unclear. But contaminated water supplies, degraded soil, and loss of forest cover are clearly evident, according to Sinhua Na, a Kashin researcher at Sophia University in Tokyo, who studies ethnic armed movements and natural resource conflicts in Myanmar. Quote, the environment and land have been destroyed. Companies don't have waste management plans, they just dispose all of their toxic waste into the river. After they finish mining, they move to new sites without carrying out any environmental rehabilitation process. So finally, China officially closed 6 border crossings into Kashin that are now under the control of the Kio, who are the rebels. The border shutdowns have had far-reaching effects. Food, petrol, and commodity prices have risen across Kashin, according to Kashin News Group, which also reported petrol shortages in the state capital, Myitkyina. Rare earth mining operations also stopped. Quote, the necessary materials for the companies aren't coming from China, so almost no rare earth mining sites can operate, end quote, said a former laborer at a rare earth mining site near Panghua, citing conversations with other workers. Very in-depth article here from Frontier Myanmar on what is happening with rare earths in Myanmar and the whole situation. So super fascinating. Finally, on the China front, just adding another puzzle piece, and we can choose to relate it to our previous stories or not, but I think worth mentioning, China's central bank resumes gold purchases after 6-month hiatus. This is Reuters via mining.com, and just a couple of lines here. China's central bank resumed buying gold for its reserves in November after a 6-month pause, official data by the People's Bank of China showed on Saturday. The PBOC was the world's largest official sector buyer of gold in 2023. Resumption of its purchases may support Chinese investor demand, which was muted since the PBOC paused its 18-month buying streak in May. So China's buying gold. Interestingly, another story we've been following that we could have started the show with, as you probably heard, Barrick Gold CEO Mark Bristow is now a wanted person by Mali's military junta, and as I was commenting last week, you could tell that Bristow was starting to lose patience in the press release where he called the charging of 4 Barrick employees unjustified, as you might remember. And so here is the story. Mali issues arrest warrant for Barrick CEO amid tax dispute. And this is December 5th. Mali has issued an arrest warrant for Barrick CEO Mark Bristow, accusing him of money laundering and violating financial regulations, according to documents reviewed by Reuters on Thursday. The report follows last month's arrests of 4 employees from Barrick's Loulo-Gounkoto mining complex in the West African country. And pure speculation on my part. But I suspect this is the reason why the junta is now calling for Mark Bristow to be arrested, because in the press release that was released November 26, so 2 weeks ago, Bristow was quoted as saying, "Our attempts to find a mutually acceptable resolution have so far been unsuccessful." So this is Mark Bristow in the press release relating to the 4 arrests. "But we remain committed to engage with the government in order to resolve all the claims levied against the company and its employees and secure the early release of our unjustly imprisoned colleagues," end quote. That was November 26, and within days, the arrest has been put out for Bristow himself. Now, finally on this whole front, it's actually not just Bristow. We have a great story from Agence France-Presse in the Africa report, Mali, why tension between Barrick Gold and the ruling junta intensified. And listen to this. 4 Malian employees of Barrick Gold were charged and detained in late November. Bristow is the subject of a national arrest warrant, although he is not thought to be in Mali. The court issued another warrant on the same day for Sheikh Abbas Coulibaly, the Malian managing director of the Loulo-Gounkoto gold mining complex. According to the same sources, he was accused of the same offenses. So for all of the articles I read reporting on the junta wanting to arrest Mark Bristow, I did not hear this in this AFP story that Sheikh Abbas Coulibaly, the Malian managing director of the Loulo-Gounkoto gold mining complex, is also had an arrest warrant issued. So I was bringing this up earlier, I think last episode. How do you evacuate? I mean, I think we're getting to that point. If they're just going to start arresting people left, right, and center, I mean, at a certain point, the safety of your employees is going to have to come first. I mean, who's going to go to work? This situation is declining rapidly. And then if you're Resolute Mining, I mean, you must be looking over your shoulder right now. So it continues to be very intense there in Mali. So coming up this episode, I'm very pleased to welcome Theo Yameogo, EY America's metals and mining leader. We have a great discussion on many of the big themes that are occurring in the mining industry, and Theo's new article called Renaissance, Defining the Next Era of Metals and Minerals. So a fascinating interview there, and many more news stories to follow. If you want to find us online, you can find us at northernminer.com. You can find us on X at northernminer. You can find us on Instagram at The Northern Miner, and on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where we also host these podcasts, and wherever podcasts are available, including SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And with that, let's turn to the news. And turning to the website, rattled by China, West scrambles to rejig critical minerals supply chain. This is Reuters via mining.com. China's trade restrictions on strategic minerals are starting to hit Western companies where it hurts. Blaming Beijing's curbs on antimony exports announced in August, German chemicals and consumer goods heavyweight Henkel told customers last month it had declared force majeure and suspended deliveries of 4 types of adhesives and lubricants widely used by automakers, according to a November 8th letter to clients reviewed by Reuters. You know, for all of the stories that are printed out there, you would think this one would have gotten more attention in November 8th. First I'm hearing of it, Henkel uses a silvery metal to make its Bondrite and Turisone branded products, core parts of the company's Adhesive Technologies division, which brought in 10.79 billion euros in revenue last year. Quote, "We have been notified by our suppliers that the importation of these raw materials has been delayed pending the Chinese government accepting license applications," end quote, according to the letter, which was signed by 2 senior executives. It continues, quote, "As a result, Henkel is hereby declaring force majeure in its connection with its deliveries of these products," end quote. The German company also said, adding it was unable to predict the duration of the situation. I mean, here's one answer to our earlier question in the introduction of how much do we have? Well, Henkel has none, from what we can tell here, at least of antimony. The letter from Henkel, which had not been reported previously, and conversations with more than 24 traders, miners, processors, end users, and industry experts in North America, Europe, and China, underscored the severe disruption caused by Beijing's trade restrictions and highlight how Western players struggle to replace China-based supply chains. Contacted by Reuters about the letter, Henkel said it was working to support its customers and find alternative supplies. Quote, "We are monitoring the global supply situation of antimony very closely and aim to restore solutions to fulfill our customers' orders," end quote. The price of antimony, scarce in nature but essential for military equipment such as ammunition, infrared missiles, nuclear weapons, and night vision goggles, rallied nearly 230% this year to about $39,000 per metric ton in Rotterdam's busy spot market, according to market intelligence provider Argus. China is the world's largest antimony producer and dominates the production of many strategic minerals. Scrolling down a bit, Beijing's restrictions bring added urgency for Western players to cut their reliance on minerals from China. Miner Perpetua Resources, for instance, is developing an antimony mine in Idaho with U.S. government funding. But new mines can take years to develop, leaving players like Henkel scrambling to find alternatives, which are often more costly. Quote, "Please note that we are in close contact with our suppliers and using all commercially reasonable means to leverage our global supply chain to address this situation and support our customers," end quote, Henkel also wrote in the letter. Meanwhile, some Western miners and processors have started to build up capacity. United States Antimony, USAC, the only North American processor of the metal, made plans to lift output at its Montana smelter, which was running at 50% of capacity, after China announced curbs on antimony exports in August. Quote, "Our decision to ramp up production was predominantly triggered by the more than tripling of worldwide Rotterdam antimony prices," end quote, the company's chairman, Gary Evans, told Reuters. China's restrictions, quote, "created significantly more demand for our finished products," end quote. He added, I mean, when you look at the actual use case here that the antimony is needed for, it's for adhesives and lubricants widely used by automakers. Like, that's what they need antimony for. To me, these are building blocks of the supply chain, and to say that this is going to be a $3 billion problem seems ludicrous. This is not going to be a $3 billion problem. And you know what's super interesting about this, too? I mean, this is November 8th. This is before the ban. And as we were reading in a previous article, basically, they put the export restrictions on, and then they never gave a license to anybody, from the sounds of it. And they just put that export restriction on graphite. Now, we have a story on Perpetua, which is coming up here, but maybe I'll just go to it right now. Perpetua Resources, Sunshine Silver to explore antimony processing in Idaho. This is Reuters via mining.com. Perpetua Resources said on Monday its Idaho unit has signed a non-binding agreement with private firm Sunshine Silver Mining and Refining to explore the processing of antimony amid a brewing trade war between the U.S. and China over critical minerals. Shares of Perpetua rose 7.4% in pre-market trade. Under the agreement, the companies will assess the technical potential for processing and refining antimony from Perpetua's Pentagon-backed stibnite antimony and gold project at the Sunshine Mine Complex in Idaho. There's a sentence that you don't read every day. The mine that is Pentagon-backed. So first it was car companies that were backing mines 3 years ago, let's say. Now it's the Pentagon. So again, if you start cutting off your strategic opponent from their critical minerals, I mean, put it this way. What happens when the West runs out of antimony, germanium, and gallium? Like, what happens? Like, it doesn't sound like we're frankly that far. Look at Henkel. So, all pretty interesting. And from my understanding, sure, the West has been putting together the Mineral Securities Partnership. Everybody has been ramping up, let's face it. But most of these mines are still years away. So, on that note, we have another headline here. Canada Mining Group uses China ban to push back on Trump tariffs. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. China's move to ban exports of rare metals to the U.S. underscores the need for trade cooperation between mineral-rich Canada and its southern neighbor. That's the message from the Mining Association of Canada, which argued that China's decision to curb shipments of gallium, germanium, and other key metals to the U.S. is a, quote, stark reminder of the challenges posed by geopolitical tensions, particularly on the reliable supply of critical minerals, end quote. And here is a quote from Pierre Breton, the Mining Association's president, who said in a statement, quote, "Imposing tariffs on Canadian mineral and metal exports to the U.S. would run counter to the shared goals of secure and reliable supply chains. Such measures risk disrupting the essential flow of these resources, undermining the competitiveness of North American industries, and exacerbating vulnerabilities in critical mineral supply chains that both nations are working to address," end quote. It does seem counterproductive to editorialize, to put tariffs on critical minerals that the U.S. might need, to Pierre Breton's point. Continuing on, U.S. Department of Energy to invest $17 million in critical minerals technology projects. This is by a staff writer at mining.com. And this is from December 10th. So today, the U.S. Department of Energy said on Tuesday it will invest a total of $17 million across 14 projects with the aim of shoring up America's energy security and supply chain. These projects, which span 11 states, are designed to strengthen and streamline the manufacturing of high-impact components and technologies such as hydrogen fuel cells, magnets for high-efficiency motors, high-performance lithium-ion batteries, and high-yield, low-defect power electronics, the Department of Energy said in a press release. And here's a quote from U.S. Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm. Quote, "DOE is helping reduce the nation's dependence on foreign supply chains through innovative solutions that will tap domestic sources of the critical materials needed for next-generation technologies. These investments, part of our industrial strategy, will keep America's growing manufacturing industry competitive while delivering economic benefits to communities nationwide, end quote. Well, I will say this. Probably the only way to compete with China in terms of BYD and manufacturing is to create your own supply chain. Because as long as they have the home field advantage as far as the critical minerals and even nickel and copper refining and smeltering, as I've long said here, you just cannot compete. You are dealing with a higher cost structure. Your competitor has what you need, and of course, they're going to sell it to themselves for cheaper than they're going to sell it to you. I mean, it stands to reason, does it not? So, Department of Energy putting in a few $1 million. I mean, considering the urgency here, $17 million in critical minerals technology. Continuing on, Nippon Steel makes final push to win over U.S. workers. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Nippon Steel Corporation clarified its spending plans at U.S. mills owned by United States Steel Corp. As part of a last-ditch effort to win over workers and politicians for its bid to buy the Pittsburgh-based steelmaker. After a meeting with the United Steelworkers leaders, the Japanese firm released a letter to U.S. Steel staff on Monday. In it, Nippon Steel said it made new commitments with regards to where and when a previously announced $1.4 billion capital expenditure commitment would be spent. The figure doesn't include maintenance or depreciation, Nippon said. The latest letter indicates there has been at least some interaction between the parties in recent weeks, with Nippon Steel saying the USW, or United Steelworkers, asked for further details about its capital expenditure plans. It's unclear that this letter will change USW's leadership long-held official stance of opposing the deal, but it does suggest the Japanese buyer is racing to do anything possible to get approval from the influential union before a federal review is concluded on whether to approve the $14 billion takeover. And here's a quote from Nippon Steel. Quote, during our recent discussions with USW leadership, we listened carefully to the USW's request for further details on our future plans, end quote. And of course, this became an election issue where both sides, Kamala Harris and Trump, came out against Nippon Steel taking over U.S. Steel. I think the problem Nippon Steel faces here is the name U.S. Steel. You know, this is just not the environment for taking over a company called U.S. Steel. It sounds like the deal actually, when you kind of go into the nitty-gritty of it, the deal actually sounds like it makes a lot of sense for U.S. Steel and the workers. You know, just from what I could tell. But the real problem here is the image problem of a Japanese company taking over a company called U.S. Steel. Let's continue. South 32 pulls Mozambique smelter forecast amid unrest. This is by Cecilia Jamasmi at mining.com. Australian miner South 32 has withdrawn production guidance for its aluminum smelter in Mozambique amid widespread and deadly unrest following the country's disputed presidential election. The protests erupted in the wake of October's election, where opposition parties accused Frelimo, Mozambique's ruling party since independence in 1975, of rigging the results. The unrest has claimed at least 100 lives, predominantly demonstrators killed during clashes with police. Hundreds have been injured and thousands arrested. South 32, which holds a 64% stake in the smelter, said road blockages caused by the protests are disrupting the transport of raw materials to the facility. The company confirmed that its workforce remains safe and that there have been no direct security incidents at the plants. And finally, a couple of interesting stories on job cuts in management at Newmont and Vale. Here's the first story. Newmont cuts management jobs in major corporate restructuring. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Newmont Corporation has let go of nearly a dozen managers, including a member of its executive team, as part of a sweeping corporate overhaul, according to people familiar with the matter. The world's top gold mining company initiated plans to dismiss one executive and at least 10 senior managers, the people said, asking not to be named, discussing internal matters. Newmont also told employees it plans to merge several business units in an effort to streamline the reporting structure. 5 units will be consolidated into 3, ridding the miner of standalone divisions that oversee operations in Australia and Africa, and combining them with units that oversee North America and East Asia. The shakeup follows a disappointing earnings report in late October that revealed the gold producer is struggling to control costs and capitalize on surging bullion prices. Newmont is spending more than expected to dig gold from mines in Australia, Canada, Peru, and Papua New Guinea. Chief Executive Officer Tom Palmer faced criticism from top investors in private conversations with the company following the October earnings report, said one of the people. So some management job cuts at Newmont, and then we had this story. Late last week, Vale Base Metals to make dozens of job cuts in management culls. So more management cuts, this time at Vale. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Vale SA's base metal subsidiary will let go of dozens of managers to simplify its corporate structure and improve performance, according to people familiar with the matter. The job cuts are part of an effort to simplify the firm's organization and extend greater decision-making power to operational teams, said one of the people, who declined to speak publicly on internal discussions. Vale Base Metals confirmed the measures on Friday, calling it a, quote, necessary action, unquote, to better position the company to withstand market conditions. And the company said in an emailed statement, quote, this week we initiated staff changes aimed at making Vale Base Metals more resilient, agile, and competitive across our assets for sustained long-term growth. This new decentralized structure means that some of our people in non-operating roles will be leaving us, end quote. So, very interesting development there. So those are your news stories. Now, let's take a look at metal prices. And turning to metal prices, let's take a quick look at the bond market for context. The U.S. 10-year bond is yielding 4.23%. That is 0.02% higher than last week. The UK 10-year gilt is yielding 4.33%. That is 0.11% higher than last week. The Italy 10-year bond is yielding 3.21%, and that is 0.05% lower. And the German 10-year Bund is yielding 2.12%. That is 0.06% higher than last week. And the Japanese 10-year bond is yielding 1.07%, and that is 0.01% lower than last week. So mixed bag on bonds. U.S. yields slightly higher, UK yields even higher, while Italy yields fall and German yields rise and Japanese yields edge lower. So all over the place in the bond market. Turning to precious metals, gold is trading at $2,720.90 per ounce. That is $53 higher than last week, so perhaps revolving around the uncertainty in Syria. Silver is trading at $32.67 per ounce. That is $1.26 higher than last week. Platinum is trading at $945.50 per ounce. That is 40 cents higher than last week, so basically even. And palladium is trading at $967 even. That is $19 lower than last week. And turning to industrial metals, copper is at $4.22 per pound. That is 14 cents higher than last week, so a bit of a jump in copper as it began to threaten the $4 level. Iron ore is trading at $106.34 per metric ton. That is $4 higher than last week. Aluminum is a penny higher at $1.19 per pound. Lead is unchanged at 94 cents per pound. Nickel is trading at $7.16 per pound. That is a penny higher than last week. Tin is trading at $13.57 per pound. That is 45 cents higher than last week. Cobalt is unchanged at $11.02 per pound. Lithium falls at $10.57 per kilogram. That is 21 cents lower than last week. Uranium is lower as well at $76.90 per pound. That is 60 cents lower than last week. While zinc climbs at $1.43 per pound. That is 3 cents higher than last week. Zooming out, a bit of a mixed bag with the standouts being gold and copper, both jumping, and silver doing quite well as well. And otherwise, metals edge sideways, and those are your metal prices. Coming up, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the Northern Miner Podcast, Theo Yameogo, EY America's metals and mining leader. We have a wide-ranging discussion on many of the big issues that confront the mining industry, or as Theo likes to call it, the metals and minerals industry. I hope you enjoy the conversation. I hope you find it thought-provoking, and I will see you on the other side.
Joining us today, I'm very pleased to welcome to the Northern Miner Podcast, Theo Yameogo, EY America's metals and mining leader. Theo, welcome back to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you, Theo, and it was great to see you recently at the International Metals Symposium in London. I was looking online. It looks like we've been talking at least since 2022. We did an interview. So it's good to see you again. Congratulations. This sounds like a newer role as EY America's Metals and Mining Leader.
Yeah, listen, I think we've been close to Northern Miner for a while now, and we've had a lot of successful impact in Canada. And basically, I was asked to add more geography and try to replicate the successes we've been seeing in Canada across the Americas. And, my colleagues and peers in LATAM and us in Canada work well together. And we're building those bridges really so that we can have more presence on the US soil too. So it's great, it's exciting. It's also a testament of the investment that EY has been making in metals and mining so that we get even closer to our clients.
You just recently published an article, it's fairly extensive, on the EY website called Renaissance Defining the Next Era of Metals and Minerals. What are some of the main points you wanted to make in that article?
To sum it up, I'll say there's three chapters that I think are really important. The first one is a no-brainer. We all been talking about it for a while now. It's really around the energy transition. So the energy transition is definitely driving higher than usual demand for particular minerals that are considered critical. Now, their criticality depend on countries, but we know they're critical. We also know that in the energy transition, we are not going to do it to produce those minerals at the detriment of environmental stewardship and social license to operate. So these are critical points. We have to think about how to invest in local mining. We have to think about how we're going to access capital that are usually tied to good citizenship with communities and the environment. So this is really the big thing, is like energy transition will continue to drive more minerals and metals. In a recent interview, I was mentioning that this is the first time where, I see some of the congratulation to the new US president talking about critical minerals that Canada can actually use to support energy transition in the US. And you have to also realize that in the Americas corridor, like I call it, there's enough critical minerals for the Americas and beyond, right? So you think about the copper, Chile and Peru, think about the lithium, Argentina. You think about the copper also in the US. We also know that we have some silver. Silver is super important for solar panels, silver in Central America. And then, of course, in Canada, you have the nickel, you have graphite, cobalt, and so on. So that's really the first chapter. And then in chapter two is really around workforce and DEI. This is where the branding of the sector is super important. I think we need to recognize that inclusive leadership is going to be the driving force of the sector hiring and retaining younger people, but also diverse candidate as in, race and gender. And the key thing to attracting talent is really the rebranding. We recently talked to one of our clients around going to schools, EY going to schools in the GTA and really exposing the value of minerals and metals for society overall and explaining how we extract and explaining some of the wrong perception that are happening because some bad apples did some bad work in the past. And last but not least, really in the chapter is really on capital and how we need to invest in more technologies. We need to raise more money to build new mines, but we'll build them differently. At the conference in London, I saw some of the presentations around how mining companies are rethinking the future of the next new mine, and that'll be really more integrated with nature and communities. So these are the three key summaries that I can come up with on this paper. And also important to notice that these are also not a surprise here, but tied to top 10 risk and opportunities both that we publish in the fall every year.
How do you feel then that the industry is performing in this regard? Like, I do feel like some progress is being made. Put it this way, the branding of the mining industry has long been criticized by the industry itself, almost. I think of conferences back in 2016 where there was a real sense that, people were not even proud to tell their family members that they're in the mining industry. I feel like we've come some way on some of these issues. I mean, what is your sense about the progress that is being made on, say, these items that you're listing?
I've been in the sector for a while now, and it looks like it progressed, but I don't think it's enough. I don't think we still as close to the other heavy industry sectors or heavy industry sure that are respected by society. I think by reframing the sector on minerals and metals, I think more people understand what it means. There's still not a lot of people understand that like cement and aggregates that we use to build our houses are actually part of minerals and metals, right? I think it's different. In the US, there's a big perception that everybody it's coal mining. I actually talked to a client recently that didn't even know the difference between, this is a mining person, okay? Didn't know the difference between thermal and met coal. And I find it interesting because I think we need to educate more people living in the sector around differences between the minerals and the metals. So I think we still have long ways to go. I think, I was talking recently like, at the conference, talking to one of the Hall of Famers. To me, it's important that we relabel the sector. Every time we say mining, we focus on the activity of mining. We're not really focusing on the outcome of it. So it makes it look bad. But you say you're producing minerals and metals, different story. So, if you think about the sector that produces aeroplanes, we don't call it manufacturing, right? We call it the aerospace industry. We talk about the output. You think about the transportation sector, we're not seeing manufacturing. Actually, all the buses, the cars, the trains, they're all being manufactured. So why is it for mining to say mining and not minerals and metals? So I think it's important to change the perception and start calling it what the outcome is rather than the activity.
That is very interesting, Theo. So, in a sense, perhaps a shift in semantics to a certain degree could be beneficial. And I kind of agree with you. I mean, in the sense that mining is, for better or for worse, it's had a difficult history as a word in the last even 100 years, right? So, it's a very interesting idea, a rebrand, so to speak, with a new name, metals and minerals. Very interesting. I would argue also, like, one of the things that could be done, which I think we saw with Cameco in the last 10 years, was Cameco rebranded uranium, I would argue, from toxic waste to reducing carbon emissions. And I wonder about the green transition, if really that could also help in this rebrand, so to speak. And so, speaking of the green transition, what are some of the big challenges you think the metals and minerals industry is facing in regard to meeting the requirements of the green transition?
When we talk about the green transition, we get a lot of political positioning. I just call it the low carbon economy. We're basically trying to make sure that everything we produce requires less carbon footprint. The first challenge really is that most of those solutions we're talking about require those critical minerals. So we're not going to have a clean energy security without those critical minerals. And this is actually what is at the center of the geopolitical difficulties that we're seeing across the world around minerals. Like how many times did we hear about cobalt or rare earth at the center of battle between the United States and some big powerhouses around the world? We're seeing the same discussions in Africa overall, where other nations are being criticized for actually extracting it with no environmental stewardship. So the need for critical minerals is the big one. And, for countries, we talk a lot about net zero. I think why we avoid to talk about net zero, because we think that net positive is a real game on net zero. But under the net zero emission scenario, copper demand is supposed to rise by 50% by the year 2040. And we also know that nickel, cobalt, and rare earth will need to be double. And there's some elements some minerals that people don't pay attention to, but graphite is super important for batteries. When we talk those critical minerals, most of the time, especially when I talk to clients in the US, it's too much of a focus on the EV, but it's actually not just EV. It's also storing energy in our homes, storing energy at work, in the plants. So the battery requirement is not just for EVs. It's actually for like bigger scale batteries. So that's the first challenge, is how do we going to get those critical minerals at the pace we need them without jeopardizing nature and communities, and still being challenged by the time it takes to approve new mines. So that's one thing. The second one really is on the macroeconomic uncertainty. So because mining is so capital intensive, those commitments are really serious, and it makes it that we need to have clarity around the consumption pattern, so the demand side, so that the supply side can actually be designed appropriately. If we look at the nickel prices that went down about 12, 18 months, it actually sent the wrong signal to the companies that are committing to producing those minerals, and definitely jeopardizes the genuine to meet your environment because they get into uncertainty in raising capital. The macroeconomic uncertainties also drive things like policy, right? If policies are going to be very hawkish, it's different than policies that are actually dovish in the world. We're going to have free trade of these minerals. So that also makes it that companies are worried. Like you've heard of the recent signal from Trump that is going to increase tariff by 25% across the board in Canada. Well, that triggered panic, uncertainty for graphite, nickel, or anybody producing critical minerals that's going to the US. So those challenges actually are telling us that we need to take an holistic approach to resource development. Governments may have to be more involved than they used to, and we need to think about a broader range of technologies we need to use to make those critical minerals come to market faster, appropriately, with minimal damage to the environment and communities. So this is why it has to be produced sustainably. I like the fact that the ICMM and many of the mining companies are now using the terminology responsible mining or sustainability, because we cannot produce those minerals. It'd be a shame if we produce the minerals the wrong way for something good at carbon economies.
Now, do you feel that we are on track, let's say in the West, on alleviating some of the potential shortages that are being projected? Like, how are you feeling about the overall trajectory of things? I mean, it's a pretty comprehensive, report on what is happening. I mean, do you feel that we are, say in the West, that we're making enough of the right moves, or do you sense that not enough is being done?
There are some moves being made. I think it was early in the summer. I had an interview with one of the medias, and the question was asked around those 5 gigafactories we're building in Canada and whether or not we have enough material to feed them. And the answer is no, we don't. We don't have enough mines being permitted that will actually feed those gigafactories. Now, since then, some of the gigafactories have gone into a lot of financial trouble because of uncertainties. So I would say there's a lot of hope that we have everything in place, but there's no proof that we actually have things in place. If you think about flow of lithium, if we build your gigafactories and we need enough lithium, well, even Canada doesn't have enough lithium for it. I know there's more and more deals being done between the OEMs and some countries and some mining companies around the world to secure those minerals. But I doubt somebody can actually say with certainty that the production being made will be going to the right destinations. So I doubt that. I wish there was some sort of a agency or think tank that can actually collect that and show the trade flows to make sure it works. But some of the trade flows may be reversed depending on how defensive some governments' positions become for free trade of minerals.
Okay, excellent. So, following up on this idea then of there being enough, of course, China banned the export of germanium, gallium, and antimony in the last week. Are we moving too slow here with something like that? Like, I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on these specific minerals, but I mean, how big of a deal is it that, say, China is refining a good majority of many of the metals that are being produced? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that recent news item. How urgent is this?
So Adrian, I would say that, I grew up in the 80s when countries used to take positions, and then the counterparties also took a different position as a tit for tat, really. So we knew that by putting heavy tariffs on some of the Chinese products, China will take some position to protect its own economy. Because at the end of the day, every country is sovereign in protecting their economies for the welfare of their nations, right? So it's already surprising. We also seen it with Russia, when Russia decided not to export everything. It dropped the price up for sure, but it's sad for mining people like myself to have an opinion about whether or not it's a good or bad thing, because that's just as politics. But it sends the signal that, yeah, this can happen. And if it does happen, OECD countries will have to figure out a way to actually produce their own minerals. I remember the years when China was building a lot of smelter capacity and refining capacity for most of the minerals, was in the time where the world was at peace and we believed, all of us, that globalization was a great thing. Now we entered in a different era, I'll say, of world trade, and things are different. So I believe that, whether or not a country is manipulating prices by stockpiling or stopping production, to me that's secondary. Mining companies still produce minerals and metals. It's an important part of the economies in the world. It helps people rise above poverty. It helps countries get more royalties and investment. So I think ultimately the mission of the sector is really to use minerals and metals that will take the world to the next level. But by doing so, also helping communities and countries become better. So does that mean that we'll have a world at peace soon? I don't know. There's a change in government in the US. We'll see if that means that we'll get a more peaceful world where the trade and the restrictions get lifted. We've seen companies in Canada relocate to Switzerland, right? Because of the restriction we put on flow of investment. Canadian made as a mining company and into Canadian assets. So it's easy to blame one country over another, but when I look at it cold-blooded, I can see that every country is taking decisions to protect their own economy.
You mentioned also responsible mining earlier and how you like that term. What do you think of this idea of, green metals? Like, how real is it, this idea that you might have a price for green copper, so to speak, and a price for non-green copper? I mean, we see it in a sense. In Indonesia, we hear of the environmental catastrophe, really, of some of the processing of nickel in the country. And it does kind of, I think it was Andrew Forrest at the beginning of the year said, we need a green nickel price. I mean, what are your thoughts on this issue?
I think it's a noble idea. It's practically difficult. Before I rejoined the firm, I was working for a company with a smelter in Africa, and we actually looked into adopting blockchain so that we can trace the copper, then therefore convince clients that the copper was green. I think the difficulty is really setting up a system that make it green or not green. The concept is novel. I remember talking to a CEO in Sweden who's building a mine in Norway, and he was saying it was going to be the greenest underground mine in the world, and that he was going to get premium for the metals that come out of it, because use a lot of hydropower, and then all the underground was like electric equipment and things like that. I think it's a great idea. I also heard some CEOs from the Labrador Trough talk about green iron ore, because green iron ore then feeds into green steel, who then will feed into like manufacturing like stoves and appliances in your house that are green. The question is always whether or not the consumer is willing to spend the extra money for it, and that we don't have an answer, right? If you think about the Teslas and the EVs, who are thinking, yeah, the world is really adopting EVs and that it'll go really fast, but it hasn't worked, right? So if the consumers, especially the masses, because it's easy to make something like this, but then we're selling it to the wealthy, then we defeated the purpose. But if the masses are willing to pay for it, yeah, then it might work. In the current environment in the world, I doubt that the premium you can get. No, I heard the terminology greenium for these green metals. The greenium you can get is going to make the consumer pay more for it, but will the consumer really be willing to pay more for it? And I'm not sure at this point if that's the case because it will go into everywhere. Like we're talking about it earlier, right? Like most people don't realize how many metals and minerals are essential to their daily lives, right? So pick a green aluminum. Are you willing to pay, I don't know, 20 cents, 50 cents more for a can of sardines just because it's green aluminum? Or are you willing to pay, I don't know, $100 more for a stove because it has green metal? With inflation right now, Adrian, I don't really that's where people are going. I think it's a novel idea in a perfect world. But practically, I find that it's going to be harder to prove. That's the first thing. And it's capitalism, right? So even the convenience store down the street will say they have it all green. We're not going to be able to prove it. So we need a way to prove it. Maybe there's some scanning technology, whatever. That's first difficult. And the second one is whether or not people have money to pay the extra.
What do you think about this idea, though, that it's done on a governmental level, that perhaps as tariffs, say one of the responses that the EU could have said to China on, BYD vehicles is, you know what, those were made with Indonesian nickel that was actually heavily polluting. Therefore, we want to, tariff that. So it's not even a consumer decision really because there's a tariff on it. Do you have any quick thoughts on that speculative idea?
I like the idea. It would mean that we basically need to have some sort of an international regulator that will certify side by side, smelter by smelter, on which one is green, which one is not. And then we have to make sure that the feed into it is also green, right? So that's the complication. I see the point, and yeah, you could do that, but you need to make sure your own is as clean.
Right. And of course, then the local manufacturers would have to match that. To your point, everything would get a lot more expensive. So, okay, so a couple of more questions I wanted to touch on here as we wrap up, Theo. You mentioned new technologies in your paper. What kind of new technologies are you seeing that are transforming the mining sector?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, it's like, I think, I was recently talking to somebody just today about mining being so behind that we just catching up, right? So simple things like new enterprise resource planning tools like ERPs, a lot of deployment of those, automation robotics. We have more autonomous vehicles in the mines, drilling systems, and more things that we can do underground. Think about even the battery electric vehicles getting adopted more and more on underground. I'll get the digital twins. Everybody's trying to do it, even in capital projects. Our teams in Brazil actually established one, and they were at the recent CIM conference talking about it. The IoT is a big one. The blockchain is a big one. There's also what I call hard science technologies, like advanced mineral processing. Like this is like real science, but then changing the way we approach extractions of metals across the mine. And last but not least, as you know, everybody's talking about AI and machine learning, lots of use cases. Not clear which way it's going to go. It's probably going to be like just a mainstream adoption of AI into the mines, and the same way we adopted computers. I think that there's a lot of opportunities there. To us, the biggest thing with clients is always defining the business case and anchoring those changes into tangible things like productivity, cost, or increase in output or some sort of something. Because when clients go after these technologies just to mimic the next door neighbor, they end up finding out that it's actually not made for them. So we have been really vocal on adopting, change management and culture change in any of these technology moves that mining companies are doing. And of course, all of these means that you got to have a strong cybersecurity practice. And that one is also behind a little bit for mining. But yeah, cybersecurity needs to be good for sure.
Excellent. And just finally here, I don't want to end this without discussing the talent situation. I mean, the mining industry has been facing a major talent issue in the last few years as the older generations are starting to retire and a lack of taking up, geology and, engineering and mining related subjects in universities. What are you seeing, and what were some of the insights from your report on the talent shortage in mining?
So years ago, I wrote a paper on the need for engineers in Canada. And I would say that the cycle is quite complicated because what ended up happening is that we tell young people to do mining, and then by the time they finish university, we actually have an issue because the cycle is down and then they don't get hired. And then it's a bad thing. I've seen that twice in my career already. 2 times the cycle happened that way. So we need to figure out a way to actually be proactive in the way we actually have the young people come to mining. That's the first one, so that they don't do the degree and then we don't give them jobs. The second one is really changing the way we deliver those courses. I've been vocal that most mining programs haven't changed at all over the years. So it's not really interesting. How do we change programs to make sure that it actually addresses what the industry needs today? And last but not least is really figuring out ways to increase the pool. And to increase that pool, to go back to the opening remarks, we will need to have a rebranding of some sort so that people understand that we're producing minerals and metals that are super critical for the planet.
Theo Yameogo, EY America's Metals and Mining Leader, thank you for joining us and sharing your insights and perspective on this week's Northern Miner podcast.
Welcome, Adrian. It's always a pleasure to be talking to you.
And thanks once again to Theo Yameogo for appearing on this week's podcast. Big shout out. It was great to see you at the International Metals Symposium in London. And big shout out to all our listeners as well. Thank you for continuing to support this podcast. If you want to help out the podcast, please leave us a review in the Apple Podcast directory, share it with your friends, and until next week, take care.